Hello, welcome. My name is Andy. I'm a philosophy lecturer, and today we will start a series together. We will go through the whole of ancient Greek philosophy, beginning with the Presocratics, with the earliest Greek thought, and ending well past the era where Greek philosophy has ended, and we are in Roman times when we talk about Stoicism, for example. It's a period of about 1,000 years, all this ancient Greek philosophy, and it's a fascinating period because it still inspires philosophy today. And the questions that started at this time were the questions that both science and philosophy have since been discussing. And so it will be very interesting. It's for me every time a fascinating thing to go through these philosophers, to go through this period and to see what ideas they had for the first time in Western history, at least. There is a whole area of Chinese and Indian philosophy, but we will not be able to talk about this, so we concentrate on Greek philosophy. So when I say this is the first philosopher, for example, then I always mean the first Western philosopher. I will not be emphasizing it every time because it gets tedious, but we have to understand that this is in the framework of Western philosophy. So, of course, there are Chinese philosophers at the same time that do their own thing, and they also have their own firsts and their Indian philosophies, which are even older, but we will not be talking about these here. So before we begin with talking about ancient Greek philosophy, we have to first understand a little bit about ancient Greece itself. What was ancient Greece and how is it different, let's say, from modern Greece? What was its political organization? And so you have to understand these things in order to see how ancient Greek philosophy developed, at least a little bit. So when you talk about ancient Greece, it's important to realize that this was something very different from what today is a country. Ancient Greece was not a country. The individual cities were independent places, and somebody who lived in Athens was a citizen not of Greece, but of Athens. Somebody who lived in Sparta was a citizen of Sparta. And Sparta and Athens were often at war with each other. Or somebody who was on an island was then a citizen of this island. He wouldn't think of himself necessarily as a citizen of Greece, as a political unit. Greece was not a political unit. Parts of it were always at war with each other. Parts of it were at war with the Persians. Other parts were supporting the Persians. So it was always a mess politically, where you had all these little city-states doing their own thing. In the course of time, of course, the city-states tried to work with each other. They formed alliances. So you had city-states that were more closer to Athens. You had city-states that were closer to the Spartans. You had other city-states that were originally Greek, but then occupied by the Persian kings. So it was all very diverse. And in this sense, ancient Greece is not a political unit. But despite that, it was always a cultural space. Ancient Greece was, for the people who lived there, a thing. They all thought of themselves as Greek in a way, although this Greekness was not a Greekness of passport or ID card. It was a Greekness in culture, perhaps in a similar way like today you would say people think of themselves as European, or even stronger perhaps, people think of themselves as Chinese. And you have, for example, these different areas where Chinese people live. They live in Singapore, they live in Malaysia, they live in some of them in Japan, they live in Taiwan, they live in mainland China, they even live in the United States, right, in Chinatowns. But wherever they live, they think of themselves as Chinese. This Chinese identity is something that makes them Chinese and makes them Chinese in a way that cannot be taken away from them by political changes. It might be that somebody is for their whole life just living in the United States in a Chinatown, but still identifying culturally as Chinese, speaking Chinese, reading Chinese books, watching Chinese shows. And this worked in a very similar way also with the ancient Greeks. So the ancient Greeks thought of themselves as Greek. And one thing that made them Greek was the language. The language was always similar in different areas of Greece. Of course, they had their local dialects, but it was all recognizably Greek. And that language contained the cultural material that identified them as Greek. So all Greeks were aware of Homer and the epics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And all Greeks knew these stories that come from the Homerian epics. All Greeks knew Hesiod, who wrote a history of the ancient gods and how the world came to be. And so, like for us, the Bible, the creation story of the Bible, for them, it was Hesiod who was grounding their religious ideas. And this distinguished them, the language distinguished them from everybody else. And this becomes clear when you think of the term barbarian. Barbarians are literally the people who speak bar, because the Greeks could not understand them, right? So they said, this is just, nonsense. It's just bar. They speak like the babies. So this is barbarian speak. And they identified themselves as Greek because they spoke a proper language, while the barbarians were just going on bar. So this today, of course, would not be the politically correct way of seeing foreigners, but for the ancient Greeks, this was clearly the thing. They were the humans, they were the educated people, and everybody else was just barbarians. And another thing that united the Greeks always were the Olympic Games that took place every 4 years, even in ancient times. And the Olympic Games were a purely Greek thing. You did not participate in the Olympic Games if you were not Greek, but they were an inclusive Greek thing. Everyone from this Greek cultural space was welcome to go and participate in the games and watch the games. And so at this time when the games were held, wars stopped, they were paused, and the soldiers left to go participate in the games. And for this, of course, you have to understand that soldiers back then meant all men who were able to hold a weapon. It was not like most of the time today a professional army, but the normal people, when there was a need for an army, when there was something to attack or when there was something to defend, the normal people just picked up their weapons and went on to fight the war. And so the most trained people were the soldiers, the best trained, and the young people who were strongest and were in the best age to also be athletes. So this is why when there were Olympic Games, the soldiers, of course, were the first who would go and participate or watch these games. Because these were just normal people who were physically able to be soldiers and therefore also to be athletes. But even older people were participating in war. Socrates, for example, participated in multiple wars and saved the lives of other people we know of. Everyone who was able had to participate and defend their country. So it was the language, it was the Olympic Games, and it was the cultural production of the time also. At the time we are talking about, roughly around the 5th century before Christ, we have the big dramatic writers. In Athens, we have Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes. These were the people who wrote the great tragedies and comedies that we still talk about. We still put them up in theaters. We still adapt them to the modern times. And these tragedies were a regular thing every year. There were contests for tragedies and comedies. And those who won the contest then went on to be performed in other places all over the Greek world. So this again united people because they had this feeling that their culture is alive. Their stories, their ancient stories from Homer. These were not only stories that were at this time already about 500 years old, but they were lived stories that developed because they were retold in the time itself where the people lived. So you would live in Athens at this time and you would go see a new play written by this guy who is writing plays, Sophocles, and you knew him, he lived with you in this little city, and he would have written a new play about characters from these old stories, thus giving them a new life, modernizing them. And in many other ways also, the ancient world is much more interesting than we think, right? We often think of it as a kind of primitive medieval world, but this is not the case. The ancient Greeks were very fond of traveling, for example. They often went when they could afford it. Of course, not everybody could, but if they could go, they went and traveled to places. They went as tourists, and there were guides, for example, in Egypt by the pyramids who would wait for the Greek tourists and then show them around, much like it is today, right? And they would show them the pyramids, which then already were 2,000 years old. So the ancient Greek who went to see the pyramids was going to see something that was as old to him as the ancient Greeks are today to us, right? So this is amazing to see these time scales, how old some things are, like the pyramids. And so the Greeks traveled widely. They had a maritime empire also. They got food and drinks and wine and spices and all kinds of things from all over the Mediterranean world. And they had all these islands that are in the East Mediterranean, the Greek islands, which, Greek culturally, as we said, they were independent places politically, but they traded with each other. And so the Greeks had access. The richer Greeks, of course, the Greeks in Athens, they had access to all these products from all these different places. And so it was a very cosmopolitan place. It was a place that was aware of the world. They even sent expeditions out to find the limits of the world, and these limits were roughly at least of the civilized world at Gibraltar, which today is called Gibraltar. Back then it was the Pillars of Hercules. And the Pillars of Hercules, what we call Gibraltar, was kind of the end of the Mediterranean, and beyond that it was dangerous to go. There was a big ocean. People perhaps thought mostly that this would be the end of the world. There wouldn't be much more after that. But there were some explorers who even went up to the British Isles, and there is also some story which is not very easy today to verify exactly how it worked out, but there was an expedition that is said to possibly even have reached Denmark or Norway. And later, of course, the opposite also happened. There were Viking expeditions that came into the Mediterranean from the north and went up to Istanbul, Constantinople, and made contact there. So there were all sorts of contacts all over the world. There was contact with what we today call the Arab world. Alexander the Great went to India, and today we even find coins in India, in Pakistan, in those western regions of India, ancient coins that have the face of Alexander the Great on them, because his soldiers left them there. And so this is amazing to realize how complex the world was back then, how inclusive it was, and there is even the possibility that perhaps there was some contact between China and Chinese thought and ancient Greek thought. We don't know if this happened, but there is, for example, in the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, there are some passages that are very reminiscent of the Chinese Tao Te Ching. And so you could think that perhaps the Tao influenced Heraclitus in some way, or the other way around, that there was some exchange between Taoism and ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophy. Nobody knows if this is true, but it is an interesting thought, and it is not completely out of the question. So let us briefly have one look at the timeline. When we talk about ancient Greek philosophy, what do we mean? Roughly, ancient Greek philosophy begins in around 600 BC, there is one point that is traditionally taken to be the beginning, but of course these are only conventional points. There is no specific year in which philosophy begins, of course. It's a movement that developed over hundreds of years. But the symbolic point that is often quoted is 585 BC, because this is when the ancient philosopher and astronomer Thales predicted a solar eclipse that actually then took place in this year. And this is a turning point, is often seen as a turning point, because he predicted the solar eclipse not because of some religious reasons, but because of astronomical observations. Today it is disputed how much observation really there was, and perhaps he was lucky. He had some help from Babylonian astronomy, and perhaps he was really lucky that the eclipse actually happened. He might have also predicted it without it happening, it seems. But yeah, we can reconstruct this, and this is also a nice thing, because eclipses, of course, happen regularly, and today we can reconstruct them with computer models. We can see when they happened according to our times, and so we can date ancient events by using eclipses. And so in this way, we can have a very well attested, very well supported date for when Thales lived, because this eclipse that he talks about must have happened at 585 BC. And so because this date is so easy to verify astronomically, and because Thales used kind of a scientific method to arrive at his prediction, this is why the eclipse is today taken to be the beginning of Western philosophy, and Thales often called the first Western philosopher. Now, the ancient Greek world ends with the end of pagan Rome. The Romans essentially took over and continued the Greek tradition. Educated Romans were proud to speak Greek. They liked to speak Greek more than they liked to speak actually Latin, and to show off their education by speaking Greek, by doing Greek philosophy. For example, Marcus Aurelius, the famous Stoic philosopher, was writing in Greek, although he was a Roman. But then the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, collapsed. It was attacked by barbaric tribes from the north, Germanic tribes who took over Rome, and then it was also Christianized. And so in the year 529 AD, 500 years after Christ, the Christian Emperor Justinian forbade the teaching of ancient Greek pagan philosophy because it was not Christian enough. And this is again symbolically taken to be the end of ancient philosophy and the end of the ancient world. Of course, these things again don't happen in one moment. So it's not like in the beginning of 529 there still was an ancient world, and at the end of 529 they had dismantled it and replaced it with Christian churches. It was a process that again took hundreds of years in different places and with different speeds. But this is symbolically what we see as the end of the ancient world, because then the Roman Empire collapsed, it became a Christian empire, and also by then Athens had stopped having the cultural influence that it had before, and so this ancient world was slowly disappearing and becoming irrelevant. And then we enter the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages first, and then the early Middle Ages at around 800, where we get Christian thinkers who then become the carriers of philosophy in the Middle Ages. So let us end this here. I don't want to make these too long and too tedious. We will stop here, and next time we continue our journey through the ancient Greek world. We will talk how slowly philosophy developed in ancient Greece from myth, and I hope to see you there. Thank you, and bye-bye.